I'm not going to take you on a forced march kind of chapter and verse throughout all of my family history. You're welcome. It's not that interesting. But I will tell you some of those stories. But you probably came because you had kind of big China questions, and that's what started me on this this project. I had some kind of larger China questions that I didn't know the answers to, and it kind of led me to people in my family who illuminated the answers for me, and then led me back out to these big China takeaways. And so I'm gonna talk mostly about that. In between, I'll try to tell you some action stories about a few members of my family, and then share a few observations about how I think a little bit differently about China, and then look forward to your questions. Now, Clay had talked about this being kind of the regular people in my family. The one uncle I talked to a lot in the course of writing this book, he asked me, I spent hours with him in Shanghai, and he said, why do you care about this story? Because we all have this story. This just happens to be mine. And I have a feeling that looking at the faces in this room, this is your family's story. A version of it, yours has too. So this is just mine. So raise your hand if you've been to Shanghai before. This is most of us. Raise your hand if you've been in the bottle opener building, the World Financial Center. So I moved to China late 2006, early 2007, and the bottle opener building was just opening up. And we all go to China and we make these mistakes about what we think it's going to be. And early on, this banker friend of mine said, well, you know what's going to happen to you, because it happens to everybody, is you're going to get skyscraper syndrome. You're going to go to China and you're going to think everything looks like this, right? That it's urban, and most of all, that the story of China is right now. There are all these kind of bumper sticker phrases people use to try to describe China very quickly, right? They're kind of incomplete. There's rising China, there's polluted China, there is aggrieved China, there is over-leveraged China, right? Too much debt. There is so misunderstood China. And of course now there is the Belt and Road China, right? All of these little axes to try to understand China that oversimplify things. And so when reporters go, the risk that we take is that we only see the instant China part of the story. And that's what I got. We're doing stories about right now, and the China story seems like it's a new and recent story. And when you talk to people there and you ask them their story, it usually only goes back to reform and opening, right, to the late 70s. And so the story often begins and ends when people talk about 改革开放, the reform and opening, as if that's the only important moment, right? That because it fits into this great storytelling structure. We all want to tell stories, and 改革开放is a great moment for the fall and then the redemption. And so we don't really, and I didn't get the full story. And so my big China question before I started to work on this book was, well, what's the longer picture of how China really got here? As an economics and business journalist, how did it really happen? And I didn't have a good enough understanding. So that was what started me in a kind of an economics big China way. I also had questions about my own family as well. And have any of you been inside the old Hong Kong Shanghai Bank on the Bund? Right, so now this is the Pudong Development Bank, the fancy building with the dome on the west side of the river. And my assistant, when I was moving back to the States in 2010, before I left, she said, you got to go see this because you never saw this. And she wanted to show me this mosaic on the inside of the dome. And what it shows is the Hong Kong Shanghai Bank kind of in the prior era of Shanghai connected to the global economy, back in the early 20th century. And so each of these spaces is where they had branches of the bank, right? This is Tokyo, and this is Shanghai, and this is New York, London. And what happened, you may know the story, is after the communist liberation in '49, China closed. It kind of raised its drawbridge to the outside world. And there was a decision made, well, what do we do about this old art, right? Because this connection to the outside world was not one that they wanted to show. And so there was an enterprising architect who, as the story goes, decided not to chisel out, take out the tiles and destroy the art, but to plaster it over, to put plaster over. So someday, perhaps when it was politically okay to do that, it would still be there to be revealed, right? Kind of the history underneath that was still there waiting to be revealed. And so I walked away from that and I started to think about, well, first of all, my maternal grandmother, my maternal grandparents lived in Shanghai in this earlier era in the 30s and 40s. And I started to wonder, well, what part of my family history was still kind of plastered over, not really talked about, but waiting to be revealed. There were a lot of stories about people on my side of the family who were on the wrong side of history. And when you're on the wrong side of history, nobody tends to write yours. Nobody tells yours. And so I wanted to chase down some of these stories of people whose names were kind of whispered or not even mentioned at the family table. So that's what got me going to chase this long and inefficient process of writing this book. One last thing before I kind of get to the first story is, in the case of my family, the way I try to tell the story of how China arrived is not through the foreigners and what they introduced, right? Those stories that's one way to think about it. And it's not through the stories of the Chinese people having kind of achieved it on their own in a way. And that's another way, an important way of telling the story. In my family, the interesting people are the Chinese nationals who are connected to the outside world. These kind of outward-looking Chinese nationals, these cultural middlemen, who would take some of the modern ideas from the outside and attempt to kind of sprinkle the ideas in Chinese soil. And that part of the historian Frank de Cotter calls this era an earlier age of openness in China, and I wanted to know more about the age of openness in the early 20th century. So a lot of the story is about that. So story number one, I'm going to tell you three of them here. So raise your hand if you have spent any time along the Grand Canal. A couple of us, right? So my family village on my father's side is along the Grand Canal in northern Jiangsu province. So as you know, Jiangsu province is one of the wealthiest in China. The northern part, which they call Subei, is the poorest part of this wealthy province in China. And when you tell people you're from Subei, this is what tends to happen, right? Everyone asks you, well, what's your hometown, your zuji, where you're originally from? And when I tell them I'm from Subei and we're near the city of Huai'an, the other person tends to say, oh, well, the premier, the former premier Zhou Enlai is from there. And then that person's head kind of nods, and it's this affirmation. And then the conversation stops because there's nothing else to say about Subei. It's this kind of forlorn part of northern Jiangsu province. It's pretty poor. It has flooded over repeatedly over time, as you may know. A lot of people in the family village talk about the flood of 1931, when a lot of the people from Subei went to Shanghai and became these migrants. They were kind of late to Shanghai, so the Subei people did not become the bankers. They did not become the knife sharpeners. They did not become the barbers or the carpenters. They stayed in the poorest part of the city, and they were, pushing, the night soil, the human waste. They were at the bottom of the ladder then. So that's the part of China where I learned the Tong family village is. So in 2009, my dad and I are there trying to find the village. But we've been away for a long time in the family, and we had this pre-1949, pre-communist name of the village. That's all we had from a distant family relative. And so we set out and tried to run the name by anybody who would know about it. We went to the police station, we went to the local government office, and nobody had heard of this place, which was called Fumaying. It meant nothing. It means nothing to you, and it means nothing to anybody we talked to while we were there. And so we resorted to driving around in a van with a driver and asking people, have you heard of this place? and nobody had heard of it. And you may know how these conversations often go. People kind of want to talk to you for a while and ask, well, why are you from Shanghai? Why do you care? Why are you from America? And is that your father there? And what's he doing here? And so that's 15 minutes you're not going to really get back, right? Having these conversations with people. And then they end with people saying, 不太清楚. It's not very clear. I don't know, right? 不太清楚 means a lot of things, including I don't want to tell you, I don't know, I know, but I don't want to tell you. You know, you don't deserve to know. I might get in trouble by telling you this, or move out of the way, right? 不太清楚 means 1,000 things, but it's a conversation stopper. And so the conversation stopped because it didn't have any help for us. Finally, my assistant found on the Chinese internet one of the towns that was near the Tong village. And so we drove to the town. It's the end of the day now. It's after 4 o'clock. And we find one guy walking by who thinks he's heard of the village before, and then he says, well, I know a guy who might know the village. So he gets into the van. And then we pick up this guy, the second person, this other middleman, and he said, well, I know a guy who can take you there. So this other person gets in. So now we have 5 people in the van. And then we pick up the third guy who comes and he transforms the van. The whole atmosphere changes in this kind of reverential silence comes upon the van because that guy who gets in is the party secretary. Of this little tiny place, but he's the most important person in that place. And everybody except me kind of knows how important the party secretary is. And he gets in and the car gets really quiet and we finally come to the village, which like a lot of Chinese villages doesn't look like much. This is another picture of the Grand Canal. And that's the party secretary. With this kind of members-only jacket, circa 1984, right? And he's there, and he had kind of this odd pose, but he was kind of looming like the authority over the whole transaction when we were finally found the village. And we get there, and it has this stream next to it, and they're washing the vegetables in the stream that doesn't look like it's supposed to be washing vegetables. And it has these familiar homes where the wealthier families have the extra level, and the poorer families, are in the middle here. And there's 2 kids and like 100 adults. And if you take away the Americans and my family over here, the people in the village have, they all have the same last name. We kind of introduce ourselves, and they say, well, duh, everybody's last name is Tong here. Because there's no real reason for anybody from the outside to go. So, which is why and that's my dad in here. And once we come, people just start materializing and they start to talk at us about, what's been happening since we left. And we get a story about my great-grandfather. And he was the first person in our branch of the tree to leave the village. And the story that we get is, it's basically a hero story. They say, my great-grandfather was a great student, and he excelled at one of the important examinations, and he went to Japan to study. My great-grandfather was born in 1880, and so around the turn of the century, he went to Japan to study. And he was, part of this kind of generation of intellectuals that, as you know, were a lot of the leading Chinese intellectuals. This is the end of the Qing dynasty, and they're part of what historian Odd Arne Wested calls China's great encounter with the modern world. So at the time, the leading intellectuals went to interact with the new isms of modernity, empiricism and Darwinism and Marxism and feminism, all these leading ideas, and the place to go to interact with most of these ideas at the time is Japan. As you know, some of the students came to the United States, a few of them went to Europe, most of them went to Japan. It was cheaper, the food wasn't weird, and so my great-grandfather was part of that group. And as you know, a lot of the leading intellectuals who are in the history books were there at the same time as part of the same underground organization, the Tongmenghui, the precursor to the Kuomintang. They were there planning revolutions and failed several times before they succeeded. And so the brand names, Sun Yat-sen was there, and Lu Xun and Liang Qichao. And my great-grandfather was kind of part of this fomenting of these ideas at the time. What we learned was, he was in politics for a little bit, he studied law, and he married a Japanese woman, which came as a great surprise to the Chinese wife he had back in the village. So that's, in the story we had in the village is he eventually came back at the end of his life, after life as a lawyer, as a hero in the village, kind of the boy who went out and made good and died and was kind of well respected in the village. And on the way out, this is my third cousin, the closest person to me, to us in the village. And he was kind of on the edge of the conversation. We had a lunch with a bunch of people there, and he wasn't even included in the lunch. So for some reason, our closest relative wasn't even in the conversation. And then when we left to go back to Shanghai, he said, next time, you eat at my house, and I'll tell you the real story of what happened. And I won't tell you that whole story, except to say that the Tong village, the little insignificant Tong village, has two sides to it. And our side is on the western part of the village. And then after the communist liberation, the people who had been in charge on the western side, the fortunes flipped. The farmers, the peasants on the east side, they were the power base of the Communist Party. They became the party secretaries. And then people like my third cousin were the ones who suffered. He didn't have any opportunities. He got the worst plot of land. He didn't get out. And if you don't get out, you're the loser, in modern China. And the tragic part of the story is his father died of starvation during the Great Famine, and then he had esophagus cancer the second time I saw him, and that was the last time I saw him. So in a way, he died the way his father did. He starved to death. It just has a picture of kind of the rural side of China, and these divisions were still there in the village. So the big takeaway I have from this is, my great-grandfather was a supporting actor in history. He wasn't that important, but he was part of this, kind of in the cultural import business, that he was connecting with some of these outside ideas and kind of bringing them to China early on in the early 20th century during this prior era of globalization and openness. And that's kind of part of this longer story of China today. Story 2. In 1911, the year of the revolution that toppled imperial China, there was an 8-year-old girl whose parents decided that they were going to unbound her feet, and she was going to go from Nanjing, where she was from, kind of up the Yangtze River, and they went to the town of Zhejiang, took a left, went across Lake Poyang, and went to middle of nowhere China, Nanchang in Jiangxi province in 1911, and she went to a school run by American missionary women. And the great find was, that's my great-grandfather. We found one photo of him. This is the school she went to, the Stephen A. Baldwin School for Girls. And the story that we found was contained in all these letters that she wrote to her American teachers throughout the course of her adult life. She kept all the letters that her teachers wrote her. One of her teachers was from Rome, New York, and the Erie Canal, and the other one's from Baltimore, Maryland. And she kept all those letters. And then, by this great stroke of luck, we found the letters that she wrote to them in these American archives. So we got to put them together and kind of find a little bit of the written correspondent story of her life. And so the earliest letter we found of my grandmother's goes back to 1920. So she was 17, I think, and she had this handwriting to die for. For those of us who had to take cursive, it was remarkable. And I didn't know my grandmother spoke English. I didn't know she wrote English. In the course of research, I found an audio tape of her being interviewed, and she spoke great English. So this was kind of the great historical find in this. Why does this matter? Well, there's a historian named Wang Zheng at the University of Michigan, this feminist historian of China. And her book is called Women in the Chinese Enlightenment. And I think it's a great title because this group of privileged girls like my grandmother, they were part of this kind of encounter with the outside world. A lot of these students became teachers, they founded schools, and as Wang Zheng tells the story, it was one of these early breakthroughs that resulted in women's literacy in China today. What I learned about my maternal grandmother specifically, and here's a picture of her, is so she learned how to play piano. She played in the Glee Club. They had a Glee Club in 1920. And they performed a Christmas carol over the holidays at one point. I mean, it was this kind of remarkable early story of education for girls in China. These kind of early breakthroughs. The tragedy in her life was she always wanted to come to America because she kept hearing about it from these teachers, and she never made it because of illness, because of flood. The Great Flood of 1931 flooded her out of her ancestral hometown of Wuhan, and she went to Shanghai and she founded a school. Her father died so this is her male patron, when she was young in 1926 during the Northern Expedition. There was a siege of the walled city of Wuchang, and that's where they were living. And during the siege, her father died. Many people starved to death during that 40-day siege. So she never achieved what she wanted to achieve, but she was certainly part of a generation that achieved a lot in Chinese history. So again, one of these cultural middlemen, middle women early on in the Chinese story. Finally, story number 3 is 1949. The early 1949, the Chinese Civil War, and it's clear the People's Liberation Army is going to cross the Yangtze River. It's clear they're going to take the rest of China, and a 10-year-old boy is fleeing, with 2 grown-ups, and he's in the city of Nanjing, and he leaves behind his white dog, and gets on a train, and they go to Shanghai, and they wait to get on a boat to go to Taiwan, where the other folks on the losing side, right, the losing side that the Americans and British supported, to go to Taiwan. And thank goodness they wait, because the boat that they don't get on is the one that sinks. And so what I learned, and I didn't know about this at all, is the sinking of the ship had casualties on the order of the Titanic. I mean, that's how many people died in this overcrowded boat in early 1949. Thankfully, this 10-year-old boy and the grown-ups, they get on the boat that makes it over, and they get to Taiwan. So that boy's my dad. There's another boy who gets left behind, and that's my uncle. And his story is a story that, to me, is this great redemption story. So before the communist liberation, members of my family were these opportunists when China was connected to the outside world, and they had all these opportunities. And then when China closed, then the people in my family who were connected to the outside world, they became the victims. They became the traitors. They became politically stained. And that was my uncle. He had relatives in Taiwan, and so his allegiances were suspect. And at the time, they paid the price. He talks about in the Cultural Revolution, his mother, who was still there, was kind of forced to stand under a frozen tree in the winter with the icicles kind of dripping into her collar. And that's one of his kind of enduring memories of growing up, as a picture of what they had to endure. So my uncle always is going to these. He's a great student, but he can't go to the good schools. And then they barely survived the famine of the late 50s, 1960. He talks a lot about how they ate tree bark to survive in the famine, how they prepared it, how they kind of marinated it to cook, and how they ate it, and how he was lucky the day he found a frog on the way home to eat. He talks very eloquently about that. And then he graduates high school just in time for the schools to shut down during the Cultural Revolution. So because of his political connections, he gets sent down to the countryside for 10 years. Not much happens there, except he does meet the woman who becomes his wife. So that's a good part of that story. In the late 70s, after Mao dies, this is the great moment in his story, because they bring back the college, they bring back the universities, they bring back the college entrance examination, and so he's almost 30 years old, and you have 10 years worth of students kind of waiting to take the college entrance examination then, and he takes it with all these other students, and he aces the test, and he goes to a great university, becomes an academic and an engineer. China's door is now open once again. So again, these connections to the outside world are good again. And he becomes a consultant to a number of factories, including one that makes power tools for Black & Decker. It's a great redemption story, but for a while he didn't want me to tell it. I would spend hours with him trying to kind of extract the details of his life story from him. And then afterward, at his dinner table in Shanghai, he said, well, there's a lot of the story you can't tell. And I said, well, what parts can't I tell? And he says, the parts that aren't glorious. And only the glorious parts you can kind of include in the story. The embarrassing parts, the shameful parts of the story, shame is as I think about it, the most powerful force in the Chinese context is shame. So I said, well, this is a really important story, and yours is an important story, and it's going to be a book that's in English. So it's going to be people far away who don't even know who you are who are going to read this book. And then my uncle says, well, I have friends in America. I said, you have friends? How many friends do you have in America? He says, 6. In the end, I decide I basically have a debate and an argument with my uncle, the first time it ever happened. It's pretty hard to argue in your second language about this kind of thing. But I not just his story, but these other stories, I decided it was important for me to kind of write the story as I learned it, the varnished and the unvarnished parts of his story. My takeaways, kind of big takeaways from all of this. By the time I started working on this book, I had been away from school for a long time. And what I had forgotten is you don't always learn about history as these big turning points. This school of history that, is sometimes described as this kind of rupture school of history that allows kind of the new regime to rewrite the history and kind of write the previous period out of history. And what I hadn't realized is this kind of earlier era of openness. The Chinese historian at the University of Michigan, Per Castle, describes these early places as islands of modernity, this kind of archipelago in early China that kind of line up with these special economic zones that are part of the modern China story here. So what I learned is there's what historians call this continuity school, right? There's this kind of continuous change over time, regardless of the political context. Another great economic historian named Tom Roski uses the word antecedents, that there are antecedents to this long story. And one of those important antecedents is human capital, kind of people and education. And that's what I learned in my family about it, that some of the history is a continuity story, and some of the roots to it are more international and global than I'd anticipated. Another big takeaway is, as I think about kind of globalization and countries being open, I think my grandmother and I made the same mistake, thinking about the world opening up. So she, on my mother's side, she, I think, assumed that this openness was going to continue. That globalization was this kind of one-way thing. And of course, it didn't happen in China's case. It hasn't happened in a lot of countries, in a lot of cases in history. And that's my story too. So when I was in college, the Berlin Wall fell. And so my framing of the world was that globalization and openness and borders becoming less and less relevant was just how I thought the world was. I thought globalization is the norm, that just because it's a good economic idea that it's kind of entitled to happen. And of course now we realize it's not entitled to happen, and it goes in reverse sometimes. And in my family, it's a dramatic kind of illustration of sometimes when the drawbridges go up, there's a human cost to it. And you can't always assume that globalization is the norm. And there are some scholars who kind of think about it who actually think kind of globalization might be the exception in history rather than the norm. Finally, so how many of you have seen, this is another picture of the schools. This elephant chart, have you seen this before? So there are a lot of economists who talk about this. What we're seeing in the world now is this great convergence. That is, a couple centuries ago, there was a real great divergence. 15% of the world really prospered during the Industrial Revolution, and much of the rest of the world just kind of didn't really go anywhere, and their fortunes really diverged. And now a lot of people think we're in the middle of this big convergence. And so I'm just going to show you one chart. I'm sorry, this is a chart. This is a chart by Branko Milanovic, a former World Bank economist. And he plotted the global income distribution. And that is if you took all the incomes in the world and you kind of plotted them lowest to highest. A lot of things are happening, but over a 30-year, from 1988 to 2008, who are kind of the relative winners in the world? Right? I mean, the plutocrats, the super rich are the winners. The people at the 80th percentile, and that's a lot of Western Europe, Japan, and the United States. The kind of the lower half of the rich countries, and their fortunes didn't really go anywhere, which might explain the election, which might explain Brexit a little bit. But the interesting part is this hump of the elephant, which is the A point, and that is kind of somewhere in the middle of the global income distribution. The middle income part of the world saw this great rise in their fortunes. And that's middle class India and middle class China. And in the case of China, this is after years of economic failure, for a lot of complicated reasons. It was followed by great success. And this is part of the success story of livelihoods for the people in China. For people in your family and mine. So thank you very much.